My name is Sophie Brown. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where results mattered more than recognition. Project rooms, planning calls, late evenings where the lights stayed on because something still wasn't finished. If you'd asked the people around me back then who I was, most would have paused. Not because I was unknown, but because I was easy to overlook. I was usually described as reliable, quiet, the kind of person you could count on to handle it. Not the loudest voice in the room, not the one fighting for credit. I didn't dominate meetings. I didn't perform urgency. I listened, took notes, and followed through. And somehow, that combination made people assume I was replaceable. Background support, not structural support. What they didn't see was how often projects only stayed alive because someone noticed the cracks before they became collapses. They didn't see the nights spent rechecking assumptions no one else questioned, or the calm decisions made when others were too busy protecting their image to protect the work itself. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or dramatizing betrayal. There are no explosive confrontations here, no raised voices or viral moments. What happened unfolded quietly, the same way my role always had. And that's intentional. Because the truth is, when things worked, it was always the team. And when things failed, it was me. Over time, being the invisible stabilizer takes a toll, not in obvious ways. It doesn't break you all at once. It wears you down slowly, through small moments of dismissal, through patterns that repeat until they feel normal. You start questioning whether silence is maturity or just fear dressed up as professionalism. This story follows that arc. It begins with who I was to them, how I fit so neatly into a role I never formally agreed to. It moves through the first small cut, the moment I noticed something was off, even though no one else seemed to. It tracks how disrespect can become routine when it's never challenged, and how staying quiet can feel like the moral choice until it isn't. There's a shift in the middle of this story. Not an argument, not a breakdown, just a moment of clarity. From there, everything changes. Not outwardly at first, but internally. Silence stops being a reflex and becomes a choice. Observation becomes preparation, and accountability finally finds the right address. I'm telling this as honestly as I can remember it. No exaggeration, no names dragged through the mud. Just a record of what happens when someone who has been underestimated for a long time decides, not loudly, not dramatically, to stop absorbing blame that was never theirs to carry. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, because it matters for what comes next. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that you were holding more weight than anyone acknowledged? To them, I was consistent without presence. That's the simplest way I can explain it now. I was the person who arrived early enough to notice what hadn't been done and stayed late enough to make sure it was. I was looped into every project just in case, copied on emails where decisions were already half made, and invited into meetings where my role was to listen and summarize what others said more clearly than they had said it themselves. People didn't ignore me. That's important. Being ignored would have been easier to name. Instead, I was included, but in a way that suggested my value was operational, not intellectual. Execution, not judgment. Support, not authorship. When introductions happened, I was described with words like solid, dependable, and great with follow through. No one ever said strategic, no one said essential, no one said, this person understands the whole system better than anyone else in the room. And I didn't correct them. Part of that was personality. I've never needed attention to do my job well. I don't think authority has to announce itself. I honestly believed, that good work eventually speaks for itself. That if you stayed calm, stayed precise, stayed ethical, the right people would notice. Another part was conditioning. I had learned over time that speaking up too often labeled you as difficult, that pushing back even gently shifted how people treated you. So I chose clarity over confrontation, notes over noise, results over recognition. The strange thing is, this worked until it didn't. Projects that ran smoothly did so quietly. Deadlines were met. Problems were resolved before they escalated. Leadership walked into updates that felt reassuring, controlled, and because nothing was on fire, no one asked who had installed the fire alarms. But when something did go wrong, when an assumption upstream failed or a decision made above my level collapsed under pressure, the question was never, where did the system break? The question was, how did this get past Sophie? That framing matters. It positioned me not as a contributor among many, but as a checkpoint, a buffer, someone whose job, apparently, was to absorb complexity so others could stay clean. If things worked, the credit floated upward and outward. If they failed, accountability traveled downward and landed neatly at my desk. I didn't experience this as cruelty. Not at first. It felt procedural, almost logical. I was closest to the work, so of course the scrutiny followed me. But patterns reveal truths that single moments don't. I started noticing how often my name appeared only when explanations were needed. How often meetings ended with action items assigned to me, even when the decisions weren't mine. How frequently people spoke around me rather than to me when discussing changes that would ultimately become my responsibility to implement. Still, I didn't see myself as wronged. I saw myself as useful. There's a quiet pride in being the person others rely on without realizing it, in knowing the full story, while others hold fragments, in being trusted with complexity, even if that trust isn't verbalized. I told myself I did not need visibility. That recognition was optional. That stability was enough. What I didn't admit, what I couldn't admit yet, was that invisibility has a cost. When people don't fully see you, they don't fully protect you. They don't hesitate before assigning blame. They don't remember your contributions when narratives are being shaped. To them, I was the person behind the scenes, the one who would handle it, the one who would fix things without making it awkward, the one who didn't need acknowledgement because I never asked for it. And when you never ask, people eventually assume you don't deserve it. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. I wasn't shouted down or publicly dismissed. I was something quieter than that. I was assumed to be fine, assumed to be capable, assumed to absorb whatever landed on my plate. At the time, I thought that meant I was trusted. I didn't yet understand the difference between being trusted and being convenient. The first time it happened, I didn't react. That's the part people misunderstand when they look back and ask why I stayed quiet. Silence wasn't fear. It was an interpretation. I genuinely believed I might be misreading the moment, and I didn't want to assign meaning too quickly. It was a routine review meeting. Nothing tense, no looming crisis, just a checkpoint to confirm timelines before a handoff. I had prepared the documentation, flagged 2 risks in advance, and sent them out the night before so no one would be surprised. When the discussion reached one of those risks, the room went quiet for a second. Then someone else, someone more senior, someone more visible, reframed what I had written. Not incorrectly, just without mentioning me. The concern became their observation. The mitigation plan became their suggestion. I watched it happen in real time. The way language shifted ownership. The way heads nodded in response to a voice that wasn't mine. No one looked at me, and I told myself it didn't matter. After all, the point wasn't credit. The point was that the risk was now acknowledged, that the plan was being adopted, that the project was safer because of it. So I stayed quiet. I took notes. I moved on. That's how the first small cut works. It doesn't hurt enough to demand attention. It feels survivable, rational, even professional to ignore. But what stayed with me wasn't the moment itself. It was how easily it passed, how naturally the room accepted the transfer of authorship, as if that had always been the order of things. Later that same week, a follow-up email went out summarizing decisions. My name appeared once next to an action item, not next to the analysis, not next to the early warning, just next to the execution. Again, I didn't object. I told myself it was formatting, habit. I was reading too much into something neutral. But the mind remembers what the mouth doesn't challenge. I started noticing how often that pattern repeated in small, deniable ways. A sentence slightly rephrased. A point attributed to we when it had originated from my notes. A decision framed as consensus when I had been the only one to raise it. None of it was aggressive. None of it was overtly dismissive. That's what made it dangerous. Because when disrespect arrives quietly, it gives you plausible deniability. You can always tell yourself you're being sensitive, that it's not worth disrupting the flow, that calling it out would make you the problem. So I stayed quiet, not because I lacked awareness, but because I was still giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. I believed intent mattered more than impact, that no one was trying to erase me, that they were just moving fast, and I happened to be someone who didn't interrupt. What I didn't yet understand was that systems don't need malice to create imbalance. They only need repetition. Each small cut reinforced a story, that my role was to support, not to originate, to implement, not to influence, to carry responsibility without carrying authority. And because I didn't protest the first time, there was no friction the second time, or the third. Silence, once established, becomes an expectation. The strange part is that no one around me changed their behavior dramatically. They didn't become colder. They didn't become crueler. They remained polite, collaborative, even appreciative, in a surface level way. But something subtle shifted underneath. I stopped being seen as a source. I became a conduit, and conduits don't get credit for the power that flows through them. They only get noticed when the current fails. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Mostly, I felt alert, as if something in me had woken up and was quietly taking notes even as the rest of me kept performing competence. That first small cut didn't make me bleed, but it taught me where the blade was. Once you notice something, you start seeing it everywhere. At first, I tried to convince myself I was projecting, that the moment I had fixated on was an exception, not a pattern. But repetition has a way of stripping away denial gently, one almost identical situation at a time. It wasn't dramatic, it never is. It showed up in how meetings were facilitated. Questions about risk were redirected to me after decisions had already been made. If timelines slipped, the language shifted from, "Why did this happen?" to "How will you fix it?" When praise circulated, it floated above my head, landing on roles with titles that sounded more impressive than mine. I started hearing phrases like, Sophie will sanity check this, or Sophie can smooth that out, or my personal favorite, let's just have Sophie handle it. There was an unspoken assumption beneath those words that I was a stabilizer, not a stakeholder. And I kept nodding. Part of me believed this was the price of being good at what I did, that competence attracts load. The more reliable you are, the more responsibility finds you, often without ceremony. I told myself this was a phase, that once things settled, visibility would follow. Another part of me feared what would happen if I pushed back. Not fear of retaliation exactly, fear of redefinition, of being recast as difficult, of losing the trust I had built by being the calm one, the reasonable one, the person who didn't complicate things with ego. So I normalized it. I reframed moments of dismissal as efficiency. I told myself others were under pressure, that leadership had bigger concerns, that this was just how organizations worked. And because I could still do my job well, because things still functioned, I treated the discomfort as a personal weakness rather than a structural problem. This is how normalization works. You absorb what hurts and call it professionalism. There were moments when something in me wanted to speak, when a sentence hovered at the back of my throat, fully formed, ready to claim authorship or clarify responsibility. And each time I swallowed it, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I had convinced myself that saying it would make me smaller, not stronger. That asserting presence would somehow undermine the quiet authority I believed I was building. But quiet authority only exists if others recognize it. What I was actually building was a reputation for accommodation. I became the person others leaned on when things were messy, but not the person consulted when they were being designed. My involvement started later and later in the process, when options had already narrowed and mistakes were harder to reverse. Still, I made it work. I adjusted, compensated, stayed late, documented more, double-checked assumptions that weren't mine, took responsibility for outcomes I hadn't shaped. And when someone said, "Thanks for jumping on this," I told myself that was enough. What I didn't admit was how tired I was becoming, not physically, ethically. There's a specific kind of fatigue that comes from carrying accountability without agency, from being responsible for results without being allowed to influence the inputs. It doesn't burn you out in obvious ways. It dulls you, makes you quieter, more careful. I noticed I was choosing words more cautiously, hedging suggestions, prefacing insights with apologies, softening certainty so it wouldn't threaten anyone else's authority. I was shrinking, but in a way that looked like maturity. And because nothing exploded, because no one openly disrespected me, it felt unjustified to complain, to escalate, to draw lines. So I kept telling myself, this is temporary, this is normal, this is just how teams work. But normalization doesn't mean harmless. It means the system has decided what you're for. And once that decision settles in, changing it requires more than speaking up once. It requires undoing every silent agreement you made along the way. At the time, I didn't know how far those agreements would carry me, or how expensive they would become. I only knew that staying quiet felt easier than challenging something I couldn't yet fully name. So I stayed, and the pattern stayed with me. It took longer than I'd like to admit to realize that the role I was playing hadn't been chosen by me. It had been assigned, quietly, efficiently, and with my full cooperation. No one sat me down and explained it. There was no title change, no formal shift in responsibilities. It emerged through repetition, through whom people turned when something broke, through whom was looped in late and who was consulted early, through whom was expected to adapt, and who was allowed to decide. I was the one who absorbed friction. If a timeline was unrealistic, I was expected to compress it. If two departments disagreed, I was expected to translate. If leadership changed direction midstream, I was expected to make the transition seamless. My job wasn't just to manage projects anymore. It was to protect everyone else from the consequences of their own decisions. And the more gracefully I did that, the more entrenched the role became. I started noticing how language framed me, not as a peer, but as a function. Sophie will sort it. Sophie can handle the details. Let's not worry about that. Sophie's on it. There was comfort in those words. For them. For me, they carried an unspoken message. You exist to make this easier for us. And I let that message stand. Because somewhere along the way, I had equated usefulness with worth. If I could prevent conflict, that meant I was valuable. If I could fix problems quietly, that meant I was trusted. If I didn't need recognition, that meant I was above it. That story worked until accountability entered the room. Because when responsibility flows downward without authority flowing with it, the person at the bottom becomes a liability buffer, someone who can be pointed to when outcomes disappoint. I began to see it clearly in postmortems, how narratives were shaped. Decisions made in leadership meetings I hadn't attended were described as operational misalignment. Strategic shifts were reframed as execution failures. And somehow, the common denominator in every explanation was me. Not by accusation, by implication. Well, Sophie was managing that. Sophie had visibility on the risks. We trusted Sophie to flag issues. Those statements sound neutral, reasonable even. But taken together, they tell a very specific story. That I was responsible for preventing failure, even when I wasn't empowered to prevent it. I remember sitting in one meeting, listening to a senior leader describe a setback, and realizing something with startling clarity. If this went well, my name wouldn't come up. If it went badly, it already had. That was the role. Reliable, useful, invisible. I wasn't expected to challenge direction. I was expected to implement it. I wasn't expected to influence outcomes. I was expected to stabilize them. I wasn't seen as someone whose judgment shaped success, only as someone whose absence would be noticed if things fell apart. And the hardest part was this: I had helped create that perception. Every time I softened a concern instead of standing by it, every time I took responsibility without asking for authority, every time I said, "That's fine, I'll adjust," instead of, "That needs to be reconsidered." None of it was malicious. It was survival, adaptation, a belief that being indispensable would eventually translate into being respected. But indispensability without visibility doesn't elevate you. It anchors you. Once I saw the role clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how others protected their boundaries while mine remained permeable. How certain people were allowed to say no, to push back, to escalate, while I was expected to accommodate. And still I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Because realization doesn't immediately produce action. Sometimes it just produces stillness. A pause long enough to understand the full shape of what you're inside. I wasn't angry. I was precise. I finally understood what was being asked of me and what was never going to be offered in return. And that understanding changed how I listened, how I observed, how I weighed my next move. I hadn't decided to do anything differently yet. But the role no longer owned me. I could see the edges now. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument. There was no raised voice, no moment where I finally stood up for myself. If you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything different at all. That's what makes it hard to explain. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blurs into every other workday if you don't mark it somehow. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a revised plan that had been sent to me for implementation. No discussion. Implementation. The changes were significant. A scope expansion, compressed timelines, and dependencies that hadn't been acknowledged. Decisions had clearly been made without input from the people who would have to carry the consequences, including me. I read through the document slowly, line by line, not with irritation, but with something closer to detachment. I wasn't trying to fix it yet. I was trying to understand it. And then I noticed something small. My name appeared in 3 places. Each time it was attached to a responsibility that didn't align with the authority I'd been given. Each time it assumed I would adapt, absorb, compensate. I felt the familiar reflex rise, the urge to adjust the plan, flag risks gently, make it workable. And then just as quietly, that reflex stopped. It wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion of a very specific kind. I realized I was looking at a pattern in its complete form. Not just the workload, not just the blame, but the expectation that I would continue to solve problems created by decisions I wasn't invited to shape. And for the first time, I didn't ask myself how to make it work. I asked myself a different question. Why am I the one expected to carry this? That question didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. I leaned back in my chair and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I did nothing. No email, no comment, no immediate response. I let the document sit. That pause created space. And in that space, something rearranged itself internally. I stopped seeing my silence as default professionalism and started seeing it as consent. Every time I quietly fixed things, I was agreeing to the role I'd been assigned. Every time I compensated, I was reinforcing the system that made compensation necessary. That realization didn't make me want to confront anyone. It made me want to observe. So instead of reacting, I started watching more closely, listening not just to what was said, but to what was assumed, noting who spoke when responsibility was being assigned, and who went quiet when outcomes were discussed. I noticed how often decisions were framed as collaborative after the fact, how frequently was risk redistributed downward, how casually my availability was taken for granted. And I noticed something else too. No one was checking whether I agreed. They were checking whether I would comply. That distinction matters. Because disagreement invites conversation. Compliance invites expectation. I wasn't angry yet, but I was no longer confused. The shift wasn't about asserting myself outwardly. It was about reclaiming something internally, my sense of authorship over my own labor. I still cared about the work. I still believed in doing things well. That didn't change. What changed was my willingness to subsidize a system that treated my effort as an infinite resource. By the end of that day, nothing had been said aloud. No boundaries were declared. No ultimatums were issued. But I went home with a quiet understanding. If I kept responding the way I always had, nothing would change. And if something was going to change, it wouldn't begin with noise. It would begin with choice. After that day, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still attended the meetings, still responded to messages, still delivered what I committed to. If anyone had been asked whether Sophie was disengaging, they would have said no. But internally, silence was no longer a habit. It was a decision. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough to see what would happen if I didn't immediately compensate for every misalignment. When a decision came down without context, I asked for clarification instead of assuming intent. When timelines were compressed, I asked which priorities should be deprioritized instead of quietly absorbing the pressure. When risks emerged, I documented them clearly and formally, instead of softening the language to make others comfortable. None of this was confrontational. It was precise. And precision is often mistaken for resistance by people accustomed to compliance. I noticed how quickly discomfort surfaced, not in anger, but in confusion. Questions like, is this going to be an issue? Or, can we trust this to stay on track? Started appearing in conversations where they hadn't before. What they were really asking was, will Sophie still make this work for us? I didn't answer that question directly. Instead, I kept my responses factual, bounded, accurate. If something was unrealistic, I said so plainly, with documentation. If a dependency hadn't been met, I noted it and waited. If an assumption was flawed, I wrote it down and asked for confirmation. I wasn't withdrawing effort. I was withdrawing invisibility. And that unsettled people more than anger ever would have. The irony is that many interpreted this shift as weakness, as hesitation, as a sign that I was overwhelmed. I heard it in the way concern was voiced. We should make sure Sophie has enough support. Or, let's keep an eye on this in case it becomes too much. They weren't worried about the system. They were worried that I might stop propping it up. What they didn't realize was that I had already stopped doing something far more significant. I had stopped protecting narratives that weren't true. When updates were shared, I spoke only about what I owned, not to decisions made elsewhere, not to outcomes shaped upstream. If something had been redirected, I said when and by whom, calmly, without emphasis. No blame, just clarity. At first, people didn't react. They nodded, took notes, moved on. But clarity has a cumulative effect. Over time, it becomes harder to pretend responsibility is ambiguous when it's being documented consistently. Harder to assign failure to a single person when decisions are traceable. I wasn't making myself louder. I was making the structure visible. And that visibility disrupted a long-standing comfort. Because as long as I absorbed complexity quietly, others didn't have to confront it. They didn't have to justify their choices or revisit their assumptions. Silence had once protected them. Now silence was protecting me. I also noticed something subtle within myself. I felt steadier, not empowered in a dramatic sense, just aligned. I no longer felt that low-grade tension of carrying things that weren't mine. I slept better. I spoke less, but with more weight. There's a strange confidence that comes from knowing you're no longer overextending, from understanding that you're not responsible for preventing every failure, only for being honest about where it originates. If anyone had confronted me then, I would have welcomed the conversation. But they didn't, because confrontation requires certainty, and what they were feeling was uncertainty. They weren't sure where my boundaries were now, or how far my support extended, or whether the old patterns would still hold. So they watched, and I watched back, quietly. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. Because when people think you're quiet, they assume you're passive. When they think you're reliable, they assume you're not paying attention to why things happen, only to how to fix them. That assumption gave me room. I began documenting everything, not obsessively, not with suspicion, but with intention. Decisions, dates, who approved what, when risks were raised, how they were addressed, deferred, or ignored. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a map. And maps tell you where power actually lives. I started to see how often decisions were made in informal spaces. Side conversations, quick calls, half meetings, where alignment was assumed rather than confirmed. I noticed which voices carried weight even when they lacked data, and which voices were expected to provide data without shaping conclusions. I noticed how frequently I was asked to sense check something that was already locked in, how my role had become one of validation, not collaboration. And because I was no longer rushing to compensate, I had the time and clarity to observe patterns I'd previously been too busy to question. I learned who avoided documentation and who relied on it, who spoke confidently but vaguely, who delegated responsibility without transferring authority. None of this made me cynical. It made me accurate. I also started asking different kinds of questions, not challenging ones, structural ones. Can we confirm who owns this decision? What assumptions are we making about resourcing? If this changes later, who signs off on the impact? These questions weren't provocative, they were professional, but they did something important. They forced clarity into spaces that had been comfortably vague. And clarity, I learned, is a form of leverage. Not because it threatens people, but because it limits their ability to rewrite history. I kept my tone neutral, my posture is steady. I didn't share my observations with anyone. I didn't vent. I didn't seek allies. This wasn't a campaign. It was positioning. I was also learning about myself. I noticed how often I had once stepped in too early. I had interpreted hesitation as incompetence and rushed to fill gaps that others might have addressed if given the chance. By pulling back slightly, I allowed consequences to surface, small ones, manageable ones. And interestingly, no one blamed me for those. They blamed process or communication or timing. That told me something important. I had been absorbing blame, not because it was inevitable, but because I had been available. As weeks passed, I became more selective about where I invested energy. I delivered fully on what I formally owned. I stopped informally owning everything else. And still no one noticed. Or rather, they noticed outcomes, but not causes. They noticed that I wasn't as quick to jump in. I asked more questions, that I sometimes waited. They interpreted this as caution, or fatigue, or maybe even self-doubt. They didn't realize I was becoming deliberate. Behind the scenes, I was also reviewing past projects, looking at how success had been attributed, how failure had been explained. I wasn't rewriting the past. I was understanding the narrative mechanics. Who gets named? Who gets generalized? Who gets protected by ambiguity? And I realized something quietly profound. I had more institutional memory than almost anyone else in the room. I remembered why decisions were made, not just that they were. I remembered the trade-offs that had been acknowledged and then forgotten. I remembered which warnings had been raised and how they had been received. That memory had value, not dramatic value, structural value. I didn't rush to use it. I just made sure it was accurate. There's a misconception that preparation for change looks like aggression, like plotting or resentment. For me, it looked like calm attention, like choosing not to correct someone immediately, because letting a statement stand can sometimes reveal more than challenging it, like letting others speak themselves into positions they hadn't fully examined. I wasn't waiting for an opportunity to strike. I was waiting for a moment of truth, and I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that it would come. Because systems built on quiet imbalance eventually test their weakest assumptions. And one of those assumptions was me. The private reveal didn't arrive like a discovery. It arrived like confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already been circling it for weeks, collecting fragments, aligning timelines, noticing how certain outcomes depended on decisions that only a few people fully understood, including me. I was reviewing documentation late one evening, not because anything was urgent, but because I finally had the space to look without pressure. I wasn't fixing, I wasn't responding, I was reading. And that's when the pattern locked into place. A sequence of decisions spread across months, made by different people, justified for different reasons, had one thing in common. They relied on assumptions I had flagged early, assumptions that were acknowledged but never formally resolved. Instead, they had been deferred, pushed downstream, absorbed into execution by me. What I realized quietly was that several of the most unavoidable failures attributed to operations weren't operational at all. They were governance failures, decision failures, ownership failures. And the only reason those failures hadn't surfaced sooner was that I had been compensating for them. I had smooth transitions that should have triggered escalation. I had rebalanced workloads that should have forced reprioritization. I had interpreted ambiguity in ways that kept things moving, but also kept accountability diffuse. The leverage wasn't a secret document or a hidden clause. It was dependency. Certain processes existed only because I understood how disconnected decisions had been reconciled in practice. Certain timelines held only because I knew which constraints were flexible and which were structural. Certain relationships functioned only because I translated between groups that never fully aligned. And none of that knowledge was documented anywhere else. Not because I hid it, because no one had ever asked. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel sober. Because leverage, when you find it honestly, doesn't come with excitement. It comes with responsibility. I wasn't holding a weapon. I was holding the truth. And truth has weight. I tested my understanding carefully. I asked neutral questions, revisited old threads, confirmed what had been assumed versus what had been approved. Every answer reinforced the same conclusion. If I stopped compensating fully, consistently, certain outcomes would change. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but measurably. And those changes would force conversations that had been avoided for a long time. I didn't smile when I realized this. I sat still because I understood something else at the same time. I had reached a point where my continued silence would no longer be neutral. Until now, staying quiet had protected me from conflict, from being labeled as difficult, from disrupting the equilibrium. But now, staying quiet would mean continuing to enable a system that misattributed responsibility and would continue to do so indefinitely. I didn't want that. Not because I needed recognition, because I needed alignment. I believed in accountability, in fairness, in systems that reflect reality, not convenience. And I knew that if I kept absorbing the imbalance quietly, I would eventually be blamed for something much larger than a delayed timeline or a missed target. I would be blamed for a failure that should never have been mine. The private reveal wasn't about exposing others. It was about deciding what I would no longer protect. I didn't tell anyone what I had realized. I didn't hint. I didn't document it differently. I just stopped assuming responsibility for outcomes I didn't control. And I prepared for the moment when that absence would be felt, not as punishment, as information. Because when support is removed quietly, systems don't collapse. They reveal themselves. And I was ready to see what would surface. Once you see the full shape of a system, you can't unknow it. That knowledge brings you to a decision point. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but deeply consequential. Because from that moment on, inaction becomes a choice as deliberate as action. I stood at that point for longer than I expected, not because I was afraid, but because every option carried weight. I could continue as I had, now with clearer eyes, keep compensating, keep stabilizing, keep absorbing the impact of decisions I didn't make. That path was familiar, safe in a way. It would preserve relationships, avoid friction, and keep the system functioning, at least on the surface. But it would also guarantee that nothing changed. Another option was to confront the imbalance directly, to escalate, to name patterns, to ask for formal authority that matched the responsibility I carried. I knew how that conversation would go. I had seen versions of it play out for others. Best case, I would be acknowledged, briefly, and then managed, given partial concessions, symbolic adjustments, and more visibility without real influence. Worst case, I would be reframed as resistant, emotional, not a good fit for the culture. The system was too practiced at deflecting discomfort. There was also the option to leave, to disengage entirely, to take my experience elsewhere and let the structure deal with the vacuum in my absence. That option tempted me more than I expected. But leaving would turn everything I had learned into a private lesson, not a corrective one. It would preserve the narrative that the system worked right up until someone quietly exited. I didn't want escape. I wanted alignment. The irreversible choice when it came didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like integrity. I decided to stop doing work that wasn't formally mine, and to do that consistently. No exceptions. No quiet rescues. No behind-the-scenes smoothing to protect other people's decisions from their consequences. I would still do my job. Fully, carefully, well. But I would no longer extend myself beyond the boundaries that had been drawn, explicitly or implicitly, by others. This wasn't a threat. It was a correction. And it was irreversible because once you stop compensating, you can't pretend you didn't see the imbalance. I knew what would happen. Not immediately, not explosively, but gradually. Dependencies would surface, timelines would strain, questions would arise that couldn't be redirected to me with a casual, "Can you just handle this?" And when those questions came, the answers would point upward and outward, toward the decisions that had shaped them. I prepared for discomfort, for confusion, for subtle pressure to return to old patterns. What I didn't prepare for was how calm I would feel once the decision was made. There's a particular relief that comes from choosing your line and standing behind it quietly, from knowing that whatever happens next will be honest, even if it's uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was choosing not to lie with my labor. That choice didn't require an announcement. It required consistency. And consistency over time reveals more than any confrontation ever could. The strange thing about moving in silence is how ordinary it looks. From the outside, my days didn't change. I still showed up, still participated, still delivered what I said I would. There were no dramatic shifts in tone or posture that would have signaled that something new was happening. That was intentional. Because the moment people sense movement, they start adjusting, protecting, deflecting, reframing. I wasn't interested in triggering defenses. I was interested in accuracy. So I focused on structure. I formalized things that had once lived in conversation, confirmed ownership in writing, summarized decisions with neutral clarity, asked for sign-off where there had previously been an assumption. Not to create friction, to create a record. I stopped translating ambiguity into action. If a direction was unclear, I waited. If two leaders gave conflicting guidance, I asked them to align together rather than reconciling it myself behind the scenes. These were small changes, procedural, easy to overlook, and that's why they worked. No one pushed back at first, because nothing I was doing could reasonably be challenged. I wasn't refusing work, I wasn't slowing things down arbitrarily. I was simply doing things correctly. The consequences didn't show up immediately. They never do. At first, people assumed delays were temporary, that I was being thorough, that things would smooth out once I had more information. They didn't realize that the smoothing had stopped. What I was doing required discipline. Old habits die hard, especially when they've been rewarded for years. There were moments when I saw a problem forming and knew exactly how to fix it quickly, if I stepped outside my lane. And each time I chose not to. Not because I didn't care, because I cared about the right things now. I cared about alignment, about ownership, about truth reflected in outcomes. I also quietly protected myself. I reduced informal availability, declined meetings without agendas, redirected last-minute requests to existing processes. I wasn't withdrawing, I was containing, and still no one noticed. They noticed tasks getting done, they noticed updates being sent, they noticed that I was calm. Calm is disarming. It makes people assume stability. Meanwhile, I was watching how often questions that used to land with me now had nowhere obvious to go. How often do people wait for someone else to step in? That waiting was new, and it created space. Space for decisions to be revisited, for assumptions to be questioned, for ownership to be clarified, not by me, but by necessity. I didn't announce boundaries. I let the system find them. What surprised me most during this period was how little resistance there was. Not because people agreed with what was happening, but because they hadn't yet realized why it was happening. They still thought this was about process. They didn't see that it was about accountability. And by the time they would, the narrative would already be shifting. Because once documentation exists, it speaks for itself. Once ownership is written down, it's harder to deny. Once responsibility is clearly assigned, it doesn't travel as easily. I wasn't accelerating anything. I was letting momentum reveal the truth, and I knew I wouldn't have to wait long. The consequences didn't arrive with a crash. They arrived as an inconvenience, a missed handoff, a delay that couldn't be quietly recovered. The AA question in a meeting lingered a few seconds longer than usual because no one was sure who should answer it. At first, these moments were brushed off, framed as timing issues, capacity constraints, growing pains. No one said my name. And that more than anything confirmed I had done this correctly. Because if I had been overt, if I had announced boundaries or demanded change, the discomfort would have been traced directly to me. Resistance would have had a face. Instead, the discomfort felt ambient, systemic, hard to localize. People started following up more often, checking assumptions, asking for confirmations that used to be implicit. I saw it in the way emails were worded, more cautious, less declarative. Just want to confirm, can you clarify who owns? Are we aligned on? These weren't accusations. They were symptoms. Meetings grew longer, not because there was conflict, but because there was uncertainty. Decisions that once slid through on confidence alone now stalled, waiting for validation that no longer came automatically. And slowly, subtly, people felt the absence of something they had never acknowledged was there. My quiet corrections, my behind-the-scenes translations, my willingness to absorb misalignment and turn it into momentum. Without those invisible supports, the system didn't fail, but it wobbled, and wobbling makes people nervous. I noticed how often leaders began circling back on decisions they had made weeks early, how often they asked for updates, not because something had gone wrong, but because they weren't sure anymore, or they were feeling friction in places that had once felt smooth, and they didn't know why. What they didn't see was that the friction had always been there. I had just been carrying it. There were moments when I could have stepped in, clarified things quickly, restored the old rhythm. And there were moments when I almost did. Because watching people struggle with things you know how to fix is uncomfortable. especially when you've built your identity around being the one who makes things easier. But each time I reminded myself of the decision I had made. This wasn't about withholding help. It was about letting responsibility land where it belonged. Gradually, questions started shifting direction. Instead of coming to me, they started moving upward, or sideways, or outward, to departments that had previously been insulated from the consequences of their own assumptions. I saw it happen in small ways. A leader asking another leader to justify a change. A timeline is being renegotiated instead of silently compressed. A risk is being escalated instead of quietly mitigated. These weren't victories. They were corrections. And corrections feel disruptive to systems that rely on someone else quietly absorbing error. What surprised me was how emotional some reactions were. Not angry, confused. People weren't upset that things were harder. They were unsettled that they didn't know why they had ever been easy. I heard comments like, "This used to be smoother," or "We never had these issues before," or "I don't understand why this is suddenly complicated." I understood. But I didn't explain, because explanation would have turned this into a story about me. And this was never about me. It was about truth surfacing in the absence of distortion. By the time anyone thought to look in my direction, the pattern was already too dispersed to pin on a single person. The system had changed its behavior, and now it was feeling the cost of its own design. By the time the discomfort turned into concern, the window for quiet correction had already closed. That's the thing about systems built on unspoken agreements. Once they begin to strain, people assume the solution is to restore the old rhythm, to get back to how things were. They don't realize that what they're really asking for is a return to distortion. I started hearing it in the language. We just need to realign. Let's get back to basics. This didn't used to be so complicated. Meetings were called with vague titles, alignment sessions, reset conversations, retrospectives that circled symptoms without naming causes. People were searching for a fix that didn't require accountability. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Unease. Not directed at me, but at the structure itself. Leaders who had once spoken confidently were now hedging. Decisions were revisited, then postponed. Ownership was discussed, then blurred again in an attempt to keep things moving. But momentum doesn't return once the underlying imbalance has been exposed, because now everything had a paper trail. Decisions had names attached. Assumptions had timestamps. Risks had owners. There was no way to quietly slide responsibility back onto me without contradicting the record everyone could see. I noticed subtle attempts to restore the old pattern. Casual messages asking if I could just take a look. Side conversations hinting that things would be smoother if I were more flexible. Concerns framed as support. We want to make sure you're not overloaded. But it was too late for that. Not because I refused, because the system had already adapted to my absence as a buffer. Once other people start carrying weight, they notice it. And once they notice it, they can't unnotice it. I watched as frustration grew, not explosive, but restless. People wanted a clear cause, a single point of failure, someone to point to. And for a brief moment, I wondered if that someone would still be me. But the story wouldn't hold anymore. Too many threads led elsewhere. Too many decisions traced upward. Too many questions now required answers from people who had never had to give them before. I remember sitting in one meeting where a senior leader paused mid-sentence, realizing out loud that a choice they had made months earlier was now directly shaping the current problem. The room went quiet. No one looked at me. That silence was new. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't dramatic. It was recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, can't be reversed with reassurance. From that point on, the conversations changed tone. less certainty, more defensiveness, not toward me, but toward the implications of what was becoming clear. People began talking about structure, process gaps from an unclear ownership. All true, all long-standing. All were previously invisible because someone had been compensating for them. Me. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt strangely sad because I could see how much effort was now being spent trying to avoid a simple truth. That things had worked before, not because the system was sound, but because someone had been quietly correcting it. And now that the correction had stopped, not out of spite, out of alignment, they wanted a fix. What they needed was a reckoning. And reckoning isn't something you can rush or outsource. By the time anyone thought to ask how we might go back, there was nowhere to go back to. The illusion had dissolved, and the cost of rebuilding would have to be carried by those who had shaped it. Not by me. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic unveiling of truths. Just a meeting added to my calendar with a neutral title and a familiar list of names. I walked into the room exactly as I always had. Calm, prepared, unremarkable. They started by describing the situation. The friction, the confusion, the sense that something had shifted and no one could quite name it. They spoke carefully, as if choosing the right words might restore equilibrium. Then someone asked me, gently, if I had noticed any changes. I didn't rush to answer. Not because I was withholding, because I was choosing accuracy. Yes, I said. I've noticed that ownership is clearer now. The room went quiet for a moment. That wasn't the response they expected. They asked what I meant, so I explained, not in narrative form, not emotionally, just structurally. I described how decisions were being made, where authority sat, where responsibility landed. I referenced timelines, approvals, and documented risks. I didn't assign blame. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The facts did the work. At one point, someone interrupted to say that they had assumed I was managing certain outcomes. I nodded. I was managing execution, I said, not governance. That distinction landed heavily. Another person asked, almost cautiously, whether I could have raised concerns earlier. I did, I replied. They're in the records, and when they weren't addressed, I adjusted. That's the part I've stopped doing. No accusation, just truth. They asked what had changed, and this time I answered directly. I realized that continuing to compensate was creating a false picture of where accountability lived. I didn't think that was sustainable or fair. No one argued, because arguing would have required denying the evidence in front of them. There was a brief attempt to reframe things as a communication issue, as misalignment, as a process gap. I didn't disagree. I just didn't volunteer to fix it. That was the moment they understood something irreversible had occurred. Not that I was upset, but I was no longer available to be the solution to problems I didn't create. The conversation ended without resolution. No demands, no ultimatums, just a shared awareness that something fundamental had shifted. As I left the room, I felt no triumph, only calm. Because confrontation doesn't need heat when the ground underneath it has already moved. I didn't walk out of that meeting feeling victorious. I walked out feeling clear. That clarity changed how I understood myself. Not in relation to them, but in relation to my own standards. For a long time, I had defined my value by how much friction I could absorb without complaint, how smoothly I could make things run, even when the design was flawed. I believed that professionalism meant endurance, that maturity meant restraint, that integrity meant carrying weight quietly. Now I see it differently. Integrity isn't about how much you can carry. It's about knowing what's yours to carry and what isn't. I still care deeply about the quality of my work. That never disappeared. But I no longer confuse care with self-erasure. I no longer equate usefulness with silence. I've learned that being calm doesn't require being invisible. The way I work now is more bound, more deliberate. I still document, still prepare, still think systemically, but I do it with a clear understanding of my role. I don't step into gaps that haven't been acknowledged. I don't rescue decisions from their consequences. Not because I want anyone to fail, because I want systems to tell the truth. I've also become more honest with myself about what I'm willing to tolerate, about what kind of environment allows me to do my best work, about the difference between loyalty and self-betrayal. There's no bitterness in that honesty, just alignment. Some relationships changed, not dramatically, but subtly. Certain people became more careful with how they spoke to me. Others became distant. A few became more respectful, not because I demanded it, but because clarity forces recalibration. And some people didn't change at all. That's okay. Because my sense of self is no longer dependent on being universally understood. What matters is that I understand myself. I know now that quiet doesn't mean weak, that restraint doesn't mean passive, that patience doesn't mean permission. I know that when things work, credit will often scatter. And when they don't, blame will look for the nearest available surface. I'm no longer that surface. Not because I'm defensive, because I'm defined. If there's one thing this experience gave me, it's this: the ability to stand inside my work without disappearing into it. I don't need to be loud to be solid. I don't need to be seen by everyone to be seen by the right people. And I don't need to absorb imbalance to prove my worth. I am still the person who notices cracks before they become collapses. I just don't pretend they're mine to fix unless they truly are. There's a temptation when you reach the end of a story like this to turn it into a lesson about winning, about proving something, about being right, about watching others finally realize what you carried all along. But that wasn't the ending, and it wasn't the point. What this experience taught me, slowly, quietly, is that justice doesn't always arrive as vindication. Sometimes it arrives as alignment, as the moment when you stop participating in a story that was never true to begin with. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed patient, stayed capable, stayed ethical, the system would eventually correct itself, that people would notice, that fairness would emerge naturally. What I learned instead is that systems don't correct what they can comfortably rely on. They adapt around it. When you quietly absorb imbalance, you don't just protect others from consequences. You protect the structure that created them. And over time, that structure starts to depend on your silence. Not because people are cruel, but because convenience is persuasive. The moral here isn't speak up louder. It's known when your silence is no longer neutral. Silence can be grace, it can be a strategy, and it can also be consent. The difference is awareness. Once you see clearly where responsibility truly lives, once you understand what you are and aren't being asked to carry, you can't unknow it. From that point on, continuing as before becomes a choice, not an obligation. And choosing alignment over accommodation doesn't require drama. It requires consistency. I didn't change the system by confronting it head on. I changed it by stepping out of the role it quietly assigned me, by refusing to correct distortions with my labor, by letting the truth surface without commentary. That kind of change isn't loud, but it lasts. If you take anything from this story, I hope it's this: being dependable doesn't mean being expendable. Being calm doesn't mean being invisible. And being ethical doesn't mean carrying what was never yours to carry. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop compensating and see what finally becomes visible when you do. So I'll leave you with one question, not to provoke, just to invite reflection. Have you ever realized that something only worked because you were quietly holding it together and wondered what would happen if you stopped? If that question resonates, I'd really like to hear your story in the comments.